a servant of God will remain standing on the day of judgment until he is questioned about his time on earth and how he used it, about his knowledge and how he utilized it, about his wealth and from where he acquired it, and in what activities he spent it, and about his body and how he used it. Narrated by At-Tirmizi. Alhamdulillah, Allah gives us the strength and will to gather here today in DKF 1.2 FKP, and we may come here with different thoughts, with different aims, with different needs in regards to the outcome of this lecture. But believe me, everybody, that we are here actually with the same intention, which is to get the blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the name of Islam, in the name of Ukhwah, and to gain what we call as mardatillah. Ladies and gentlemen, before we start the lecture, I would like to call upon Dr. Ahmad Najak bin Mukhtar, Head of Aqidah and Religion Program, FKP, to recite the dua. فَلْيَتَفَضَّلْ مَشْكُورًا.
الفاتحة. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. حمدا حامدين، حمدا شاكرين، حمدا يوافي نعمه ويكافئ مزيده. يا ربنا لك الحمد كما ينبغي لجلال وجهك الكريم وعظيم سلطانك. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد صلاة تنجينا بها من جميع الأهوال والآفات، وتقضي لنا بها من جميع الحاجات، وتطهرنا بها من جميع السيئات، وترفعنا بها عندك على الدرجات، وتبلغنا بها أقصى الغايات من جميع الخيرات في الحياة وبعد الممات. وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. اللهم اجعل جمعنا هذا جمعا مرحوما، وتفرقنا من بعده تفرقا معصوما. اللهم أحسن عاقبتنا في الأمور كلها، وأجرنا من خزي الدنيا وعذاب الآخرة، وأصلح لنا في ذرياتنا إنا تبنا إليه وإنا من المسلمين. اللهم اقسم لنا من خشيتك ما تحول به بيننا وبين معاصيك، ومن طاعتك ما تبلغنا به جنتك، ومن اليقين ما يهون علينا مصائب الدنيا. ومتعنا بأسماعنا وأبصارنا وقوتنا ما أحييتنا، واجعله وارث منا، واجعل ثأرنا على من ظلمنا، وانصرنا على من عادانا، ولا تجعل مصيبتنا في ديننا، ولا تجعل الدنيا أكبر همنا ولا مبلغ علمنا، ولا تسلط علينا من لا يرحمنا يا أرحم الراحمين. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربنا آتنا من لدنك رحمة وهيئ لنا من أمرنا رشدا. اللهم اختم لنا بحسن الخاتمة، ولا تختم علينا يا الله بسوء الخاتمة. اللهم اجعل آخر كلامنا عند انتهاء آجالنا قول لا إله إلا الله. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون، وسلام على المرسلين، والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Thank you very much, Dr. Najak, for the doa recitation. Ladies and gentlemen, next I would like to invite yang berbahagia, Professor Tan Sri Datuk Zulkifli bin Abdul Razak, Chair of Islamic Leadership USIM, to give his welcoming speech. فليتفضل مشكورا.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera. Excellencies, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, let me first of all take this opportunity to welcome you to the university, and certainly on behalf of the Chair of Leadership, Islamic Leadership, under the name of Tuan Guru Haji Muhammad Yassin Muhammad, We have been, for the last 6 months or so, organizing a discourse of this nature in a way of trying to understand the whole issue about Islam and Islamic leadership. And today I'm indeed very privileged to have the concurrence of Brother Ian Buchanan to come and discuss with you on a very pertinent book called The Armies of God, a study of militant Christianity. This book was released in the year 2010, has since then been bothering me, because to be honest, it takes a long time for me to finish this book. Each time we read this book, you need to sit down and pause and think about it, of where we are going. I just completed this book 2 years after reading it, and trying to digest the kind of issue that Ian has brought forth, that many of us, I think, are not aware of or not even sensitive to. So I'm indeed very grateful that Ian has made this occasion a reality. I know Ian is a very busy person and also writing another book perhaps, but this is something that I would want to thank you for, and also recognize your presence today, so that we can have a kind of a discussion that we would not have otherwise without the presence of Ian Buchanan. I would want also to mention that this is not a one-time thing. I don't think we want and finish this off within an hour and a half. We want to engage Ian more on what has been said and to understand this message correctly, because the world is in a state where it is actually very discouraging to many of us. And we want to see how we can put it right, and by understanding the issues well, perhaps we can begin with Malaysia and tell the world that actually Malaysia can solve this problem and take a leadership role in trying to make the world a better place to live. So on that note, let me thank Ian and also the strong supporter, Sister Maznul. We have known each other for quite a while. When I was in USM, we were launching another book called the Fatimah Kampung. Is that the right thing? There's again another book by Ian about a traditional life in Malaysia, a very well illustrated book, and it's a fantastic book to have. So Ian is not only about things of this nature, but also about life as it is in Malaysia. He has been in Malaysia for a long time. So on that note, I thank you once again for being here, and hope they will have some barakah from this session today for us to move forward. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh.
Professor Tan Sri Datuk Zulkifli Abdul Razak for his welcoming speech. And now I would like to invite the moderator for the lecture to take over the floor. But before that, let me introduce a brief background of the moderator. So our moderator today is Dr. Muhammad Nasrin bin Muhammad Nasir, and he is a PhD holder in Islamic Thoughts from the International Islamic University of Malaysia. He is also a senior lecturer in Aqidah and Religion program, Faculty of Leadership and Management. And Dr. Muhammad Nasrin now is the Deputy Director for the Islamic Institute of USIM. And without further ado, please welcome our moderator, Dr. Muhammad Nasrin bin Muhammad Nasir.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good morning to everybody. I think we are very honored today, for we have our speaker with us today who have come a long way. This being, I think, one of the lecture in part of a lecture series called Tuan Guru Haji Muhammad Yassin bin Muhammad Chair of Islamic Leadership Public Lecture Series. And the title of the lecture is Islam in a Globalized World, Evangelization, a Global Business by Mr. Ian Buchanan. Before I invite the speaker, I'd like to give a bit of a bio data, if I can. And this is based wholly on the newspaper article which appeared in 2009. So that was around 6 years ago when he launched his book Fatimah's Kampung, actually with Tan Sri Zul. According to this newspaper article, Mr. Ian basically came to this part of the world, Southeast Asia, around 45 or 46 years ago. And he came to teach in and was, I think, at that moment in time, based in Singapore or based in Malaysia? Based in Malaysia. And he was a lecturer in geography, and this obvious trait of being a person who can understand and appreciate landscapes and read maps properly, I would guess, would have come to him from his father, who was a lecturer himself before, and a geographer as well, and who has basically took Ian to South Africa, Nigeria, and New Zealand, teaching and geography. And apart from that, Ian has kind of an interest in understanding culture. And from looking at the book, you can see that a person who is of varied interests, apart from trying to understand culture, he has a very good app in understanding and looking at the intricacies or the mechanism behind certain ideas and certain movements, which is quite good. And from he left Malaysia and went back to Leicester, and where he taught for another 20 years. And in the 1990s, he retired as a university lecturer. And from then on, he started his own passion. Ian has a passion of also painting. Okay, he's also a good artist, which I believe some of you have seen in the book Fatimah's Kampung. Because of the free time that he has conducted a lot of research that he can pursue a lot more in writing. And this book that we are discussing today, The Armies of God, a study in militant Christianity, is actually a very well-researched book and goes up to over 300 pages as information, connections, history, I don't know, everything that you can say when you want to write something of this magnitude. Is quite an achievement. And we have to thank Ian for actually laboring quite a lot and producing such a good masterpiece. I think I won't bore you a lot more with me talking here. I would like to invite Mr. Ian to come and give his speech.
Wassalamualaikum. Can I just first ask you, can you hear me if I don't talk with this? Okay. I am very well aware, coming here, that I may be saying nothing new, that there is a lot of learning here that I don't know simply because I do not speak good Malay. So, okay, thank you. Okay. With that disadvantage that I have, I'll proceed. My biography has already been given to you, so I won't give you any biography as I had planned to do. What I'll do is go straight on to the lecture. Except to say one thing. I am not sponsored by anybody. No one sponsors me. I'm a member of no agency, and no agency pays my dues. I am totally on my own in what I think and what I say. Now, to begin with, I'd like to make 4 general comments about evangelical Christianity. Firstly, Christianity is far more than evangelicalism. If we consider as evangelical those people who believe in God's Great Commission, as in Matthew, who seek to spread the gospel in an organized way, and who believe in Christ's second coming, then there are about 700 million evangelicals in the world. It's about 26 to 30% of the Christian population. However, the influence of this minority, in both religious and secular terms, is out of all proportion to its size. I think we've got a bit of a problem. Can I use this instead? Because this seems to be echoing a lot. Okay. Yeah, this is not echoing quite as much. So the influence of this minority, both in religious and secular affairs, is completely out of proportion to its size. And this is only partly because of fervor on the part of the evangelicals. It is mainly because the evangelical movement
Test, test.
Okay, thank you. Okay, that's probably better. The traditional evangelist is known as, regarded as the lone missionary amongst fierce unbelievers, the martyr for the Christian cause, the simple man talking to simple people. These images have a hallowed and much deserved place in Christian tradition. We are not concerned with these people. Rather, we are concerned with a huge, largely impersonal, highly corporatized, and very powerful system of exerting power, religious, but also socio-economic and political power, over whole countries. We are talking about complex global networks, about more than 4,000 evangelical agencies, many fairly small, but many over 10,000 people on their staff, all tightly and efficiently integrated with one another and pursuing common global strategies. The third general point is that the evangelical movement is diverse. According to the World Christian Encyclopedia, there are over 30,000 different Christian denominations, which means the evangelical movement is diverse both in denominational terms and in tactical terms. There are certain important differences, like that between mainstream churches and those of the Pentecostal charismatic traditions. And within this latter group, there is the new apostolic reformation, which we can talk about later on, maybe after the talk. However, despite such differences, and this is the fourth point, the evangelical movement has considerable unity. denominational differences are usually not a bar to strategic cooperation for evangelization. The key point here is that in the evangelical movement there may be tactical differences, but there is a great deal of strategic cooperation. Indeed, on most major objectives, such as organized evangelization of all cultural groups, such as the penetration of all sectors of a secular society in a systematic way, such as countering Islam, such as the promotion of a wider human rights agenda in conjunction with the evangelical thrust. And mind you, this is an extremely important aspect of evangelization, human rights advocacy. In all these respects, the evangelical system operates with considerable strategic unity of purpose, whatever the differences. So there are two keys to understanding the effectiveness of the evangelical movement. One is the unity of its intention, and the other is the unity of its network. Now, before we go on any further, I think I need to give you a bit of necessary history. So bear with me on this, but it is important. Can we have the second second one? Can we go to the second one? Is that the second one? Ah, there we are. The rise of the modern evangelical movement was mainly a response to the political situation facing the Western world following World War II. By the 50s, it was clear that there were two major threats to Western global hegemony. Firstly, the spread of communism from China and the USSR. And secondly, the rise of nationalism in the colonial world and the push for independence. In an effort to deal with these two threats, Western governments sought the help of organized religion, as they had for hundreds of years. There's nothing new about that. There were a number of strategic successes in which the use of organized religion as a political force was important. For example, communism was rolled back in Italy and Greece. The emergence of South Korea as an ally was partly propelled by an intense campaign of Christianization, partly by groups like Campus Crusade. The emergence and efforts to reassert influence in the Middle East were marked by two factors, which had very strong religious implications. Firstly, the creation of Israel, and secondly, the fomenting of religious opposition to nationalist leaders like Abdel Gamal Nasser. Now, these developments were not accidental. They were parts of the strategic rearranging of world politics following World War II. And to support this rearranging, an organized network began to emerge with a clear strategy of combining religion with politics to support Western power. In this process, two main streams, one religious and one secular, were gradually connected. Firstly, during the 1940s, the evangelical groups themselves came together in formal alliance, especially in the United States. For example, the Youth for Christ Alliance, the National Association of Evangelicals, the Evangelical Fellowship of Missionary Agencies, groups like that. At the same time, many of the agencies which now dominate the movement also emerged. For example, Mission Aviation Fellowship, Fuller College, one of the most critical institutions in the whole of evangelical modern history. the Billy Graham Evangelical or Evangelistic, to give it its right association. And bear in mind that the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association produces one of the most influential evangelical papers, Christianity Today. Also World Vision and Campus Crusade. And groups like World Vision we can talk about again later on if you like, because they are incredibly important and what they do is an enormously complex business. So that was the first point, the consolidation and diversification of evangelical groups. Secondly, during the 40s and 50s, a number of key political organizations were either created or reshaped. Amongst them the CIA, the RAND Corporation, the American Enterprise Institute, the American Zionist Committee, which became AIPAC some years later, and also the Committee on Present Danger. So while these two processes, one religious and one secular, were going on, there was also a process at work combining the two. During the 40s and 50s, two very discrete networking groups brought together a cross-section of national leaders, both secular and religious, for the purpose of shaping evangelicalism as a tool of Western politics. There was a Fellowship of the Burning Heart, which helped to introduce the idea of the White House prayer breakfasts, which influenced much of Billy Graham's work. And Billy Graham was, again, an extremely important actor in all this. And which also led to the creation of Campus Crusade, one of the largest of the agencies. And there was also a secretive Christian pressure group called the Family, and later on called the Fellowship Foundation. This came to run the prayer breakfasts, and it created a tradition of bringing together selected world leaders, key corporate leaders, such as the Rockefellers, media leaders like Henry Luce, evangelical groups like World Vision, and key US political leaders, all around an agenda of global Western-led dominion. The deputy leader of the fellowship, a man called David Coe, summed up the fellowship's purpose to fellowship in turns once with the following words. He said, "You guys are here to learn how to rule the world." Now, what was important was the emergence between 1945 and 1975 of a network linking all these players for the purpose of a clearly defined common strategy of applying religion to power politics, mainly for the purpose of maintaining Western influence in a non-Western world that was rapidly expelling its European colonial masters. We must keep in mind the political context of this time: the emergence of communist China, the Suez Crisis, decolonization, and so on. The rise of the modern evangelical movement was strongly influenced by this context, and also, of course, the withdrawal of the United States from Vietnam. From the mid-70s onwards, the movement's global strategy was most clearly expressed in a series of evangelical congresses and consultations called the Lausanne Movement, which was largely organized by an alliance of three members: Fuller Seminary, World Vision, and the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. The aim of the Lausanne Movement was simple but far-reaching. It was to plan and implement a strategy of global evangelization which was contextualized or packaged for the non-Western world, with a view to both spreading Christianity and reinforcing Western political and economic dominance. The two went together. Contextualizing mission for the non-Western world meant four things. Firstly, presenting the gospel to around 10,000 different cultural groups. Second, integrating the religious push and the secular interests of the West's corporate and political leaders. Thirdly, expressing sympathy for third world problems like poverty, weak terms of trade, weak rural development, and so on, keeping in mind the prevailing suspicion of Western motives which accompanied decolonization. The Lausanne movement was very much a response to decolonization and to repackaging Western presence in the non-Western world. Fourthly, this involved the transfer of as much frontline activity as possible from white to non-white personnel, and an urgent expansion of the non-Western missionary force. Now, between the first Lausanne World Congress, held in Lausanne, Switzerland in 1974, and the third, held in Cape Town 4 years ago, 2010, there were more than 20 major meetings under the Lausanne movement umbrella on a wide range of subjects. They included the North American Conference on Muslim Evangelism, 78, the consultation on the relationship between evangelization and can you hear? The consultation on the relationship between evangelization and social responsibility, 82. The Kaleidoscopic Global Action Plan, 1989. And the Chinese Congress on World Evangelization, 2001. Now, as this consultation process went on during the 35 years, 74 to 2010, two interrelated things happened. Firstly, the global infrastructure of the evangelical movement was consolidated and expanded. Secondly, the world's Christian population increased rapidly. As for infrastructure, the number of missionaries in countries other than their own went up from less than 100,000 to more than 420,000. Over 3,000 new agencies appeared in addition to the 1,000 that there already was there. And regional networks involved to complement and unite the global mission network, including, crucially, prayer networks. And again, we can talk about the whole meaning of prayer networks later on. 3 major new versions of the Bible were published, not just translations, 3 major versions of the Bible were published. And by 2010, the Bible had been wholly or partially translated into 2,500 different languages. And servicing this, finally, a number of huge new electronic databases evolved to accommodate evangelical research into the world's thousands of ethno-linguistic groups and to coordinate strategy and tactics amongst the thousands of agencies that were approaching them. So that's the infrastructure. As for the population, 2 simple sets of statistics show what happened. As far as total Christians are concerned, in 1970, there were about 700 million Christians in the Western world, and about 500 million in the non-Western world. By 2010, there were 900 million Christians in the Western world, which was a 30% increase. and there was 1.3 billion Christians in the non-Western world, which was a 160% increase, or thereabouts. But if you look at evangelical Christians by themselves, you get a slightly different picture. In 1970, there were about 75 million evangelical Christians in the Western world and about 50 million in the non-Western world. By 2010, the West had about 150 million evangelical Christians, which is a 100% increase, thereabouts, while the non-Western world had about 500 million, an increase of over 900%. So in 40 years, Christianity had gone from being a predominantly Western religion to being a predominantly non-Western religion. Now let us define more clearly the modern evangelical movement. Can we change the... No, thanks. Firstly, the evangelicals' stated objective is simple but radical. It is to spread Christianity to every culture, every linguistic group, every community in the world, to plant churches in every community that can be identified as being a community. That is, to introduce the Bible to, plant churches among, and convert, or where already Christian, strengthen the faith of members of some 12,500 different ethno-linguistic groups, and to do this in whatever way possible. This so-called Great Commission is a key task for evangelicals, although many take the objective further and seek to comprehensively transform total nations along biblical lines, with some aiming for a step even further than that, the eventual establishment of a Christian covenant government. However, the rationale for doing what the evangelicals are doing is both biblical and secular. Firstly, biblically, I'm sure we all know that evangelization is driven by a number of key texts. For example, in the book of Mark, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." Or the book of Matthew, "Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and of the Holy Ghost," or Spirit. But these aren't the only texts. For many evangelicals, evangelization is a matter of spiritual warfare, a battle to be waged against a host of demons. And there are many texts which inspire the man going into battle, which inspire the fighter for God. For example, Matthew chapter 11, verse 12, Ephesians chapter 6, 13, which talks about donning the full armor of God. Isaiah chapter 5, verse 28, which talks about sharpening the arrows in preparation for war. So there are biblical rationales, but there is also a modern secular context to these biblical injunctions. And that is, the modern evangelical movement as a corporate system is concerned with systematic evangelization at a strategic and global level, within a context of asserting Western economic, political, and military hegemony. This sounds a bit like a rant, but this is the context, and this is a context that has to be taken into account whenever one is looking at the operation of evangelical groups from the West. They have a subtext, and it is a secular subtext. Now, this means that the scale of the movement is vast. The movement's 4,500 odd agencies employ over 1 million full-time workers, and they annually handle about 2 million short-term missionaries. While there are many small agencies, some are the size of big global corporations. World Vision has 22,000 employees, and it has a budget the size of the ordinary United Nations budget. Campus Crusade has got 25,000 workers. Youth with a Mission has 17,000 workers. But more importantly, all these agencies benefit from a huge, complex, and well-resourced infrastructure of governments, corporations. About 25–30% of World Vision funds come from the State Department, for example. Governments, corporations, hundreds of seminaries and colleges. In the US alone, there are something like 700 evangelical seminaries and colleges. Some $400 billion in liquid assets. Some 400 million Christian computers. 600 aircraft. And about 500,000 Protestant churches alone. So the scale is enormous. The agencies then are generally very well funded, efficiently organized, their reach is global, and they purposefully combine both religious and secular affairs. The key to their success lies partly in the way they combine religious and secular activity, and partly in the efficiency of the network that they belong to. So let's look at each of these briefly in a bit more detail. Christian evangelization, both during colonial times and today, deliberately combines both religious and secular activity as a matter of policy. This is the case for two main reasons. One, evangelization allows politicians to gain political and economic influence over a target group by controlling its religious life. Secondly, secular involvement allows missionaries to gain religious influence in a community by influencing that community's secular day-to-day life. So it works both ways. There is no separation between the religious and the secular life in evangelization. It is holistic. It targets not only the whole individual, it targets the whole community, the whole nation, the whole world. Now, how does this work in practice? In colonial times, evangelical workers were part of the colonial infrastructure. They belonged, they were institutionally there. Today, with the end of direct political colonization, the process of establishing influence over a country must be much more subtle. Western missionaries are no longer partners of an occupying government. Instead, they, and the Western governments which use them, must often seek loopholes of various kinds to gain entry. So they come in as missionaries, but more importantly, they come in as all sorts of other things. Teachers, students, engineers, entertainers, footballers, social workers, and so on. And they come with an agenda, remember, which is both religious and secular. Now, this undercover work goes by many different names. There's business as mission. There's tent making, which has biblical origins as a term. You make a tent as an evangelist in the old days. Insider movements, which you can look at later on. Relief and development. Human rights advocacy. The three-legged stool of state, church, community activity, and so on. So this brings us to one of the most important features of the modern evangelical movement. Its elaboration of networks, and a multitude of subsidiaries, proxies, and packaging which allow it to cloud the connection between the secular and the religious, and thereby to obscure its intentions. So the evangelical movement is very much a global network of networks. Can we try the last one? Can we go back? I think we might have to go back then. There's a table which sums up network. There we are. Okay, we leave it at that. While I'm talking, just look at that. The evangelical movement, it's very much a global network of networks. This very basic table indicates some of the varieties of network. The important thing is that all these networks interact with one another at many, many different levels. There is a high degree of synergy amongst them. Indeed, without a global network of some efficiency, the movement's intent can never be realized. So for this reason, the West evangelical movement and those wishing to exploit it have evolved this complex, highly structured, pervasive networking system. And it provides a myriad of different ways of penetrating the target. Now, I'd like to go on from that general outline of the problem to illustrate everything I've been saying up to now with a case study. And I'd like to look, as you probably saw on the outline, at the example of Muslim evangelization. Now, the evangelical movement has many targets. Many targets. Secularism, animism, homosexuality, idol worship, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam, amongst them. It's not just Islam. Buddhists in many parts of the world are equally worried. But without doubt, Islam is the most prominent of these targets. And it is the target most affected, perhaps, by the interplay of secular and religious motives in evangelization. So for the rest of the talk, I'd like to focus on Islam. Now, evangelization of Islam, obviously, or of Muslims, sorry, is hardly a recent development. But it's only in the past 40 years or so that the effort has become an exercise in global subversion, systematically promoted, politically sanctioned, and academically supported. Political events in the 70s, combined with the Lausanne process, especially the Glen Eyrie Conference on Muslim Evangelization in 1978, to shape Western fears of the Islamic threat into a clearly defined strategy. And central to this strategy was the newly invigorated evangelical movement. For the United States, as I've hinted earlier, the 1970s were a difficult time. Support for Israel during its war with Egypt and Syria encouraged Arab oil producers to impose an oil embargo in 1973, which led to a quadrupling of the oil price and helped to precipitate a stock market crash. In 1975, the US finally left Vietnam, defeated after a war which had lasted well over a decade. In 1979, the Shah left Iran and the Islamic Republic was established. In one way or another, oil supply was a key issue for an economy which was already overheated by war, overheated by consumerism, and threatened by declining domestic output and rapidly increasing imports. Between 1970 and 1980, US oil production fell from 9.6 million barrels per day to 8.6 million barrels per day, while imports rose significantly from 1.3 to 6.5 million barrels a day. Now, amongst the complexities of the scene, one was seen as especially ominous. Muslim countries accounted for about 65% of the world's oil reserves and about 50% of all production. Already a key factor in imperial planning, religion would need to be mobilized in new and more effective ways to ensure Western dominance. There were two strands to this strategic use of religion. Firstly, there was the pragmatic use of Islamic fundamentalism to blunt nationalism and the left, most notably in Egypt, Iran, Afghanistan, the Arab Peninsula, North Africa, and Indonesia. Second, there was the systematic and ideologically driven use of Christian fundamentalism as a weapon of political control. Both would gain a powerful impetus during the 1970s. Most crucially, the 70s marked the first decade of the Lausanne movement. The first International Congress on World Evangelization, which was Lausanne I, was held, as I said earlier, in 1974. In 1976, Fuller College established the US Center for World Mission. In 1977, in collaboration with Fuller College, what was called the Pasadena Consultation on the Homogeneous Unit Principle, which is basically about cross-cultural evangelization, including contextualization, that was held. And in 1978, the Willowbank Consultation on Gospel and Culture was held. Then, later on in that year, 78, a year dubbed the Year of the Muslim by Fuller College, the North American Lausanne Committee opened its conference on Muslim evangelization. The meeting was a highly political event with two of the government's key evangelical associates deeply involved. World Vision was co-sponsor, and the Navigators provided the venue at their Glen Erie headquarters in Colorado. A very quick digression here. While I was doing my work for the Armies of God, one thing troubled me immensely, and that was that there must be a connection between World Vision and the Fellowship Foundation in Washington. And I couldn't find it, but I knew it was there. And I trawled through website after website. I must have gone through about 200 or 300 websites looking for it. And then I came across an Internal Revenue Service form which had been filled in by the Fellowship Foundation as a charitable, religious, non-taxable body, which at the very end listed a number of groups which were considered sister organizations or supportive ministries. One was World Vision and the other was the navigators. You try hard enough, eventually you will find what you want. Now, the evangelicals were already refining their approach to non-Western missionizing more generally, to counter post-colonial sensitivities. And they'd begun to develop cultural subversion as a serious exercise in social science, supported by systematic research, by massive field work, by a huge force of non-white operatives, and sizable funding from political groups. There were three main movers. There was Fuller College and its associated World Center for World Mission, US Center for World Mission. There was World Vision's Mission Advanced Research and Communication under Dayton. And there was the Lausanne Congress on World Evangelization Strategy Working Group. And that latter was under someone who will come up against later on, C. Peter Wagner of Fuller College. The task was twofold: to gather and process cultural intelligence about unreached peoples, in inverted commas, and to design culturally contextualized mission strategies with which to evangelize them. Computerization was a particular boon in this. It allowed the creation of global mission networks of increasing complexity and power, and it gave them access to huge data banks of anthropological, linguistic, socio-economic, political, and religious information for evangelical and for political purposes. Amongst the cross-cultural mission agencies and networks which resulted from this effort, 4 were especially important. There was Global Mapping International, 1983. There was the International Prayer Assembly for World Evangelization, which was held initially in Seoul in South Korea in 1984. There was AD 2000 and beyond, and the 1040 window, which I'm sure some of you have heard about. 1989, that was introduced. And there was the Joshua Project, a vast compendium of anthropological information on every culture group in the world, 1995. So all this is quite recent. It was, for evangelicals, a preparation for holy war. As the organizers of the Joshua Project put it, and I quote them, "As Joshua sent out the spies to survey the land and report on its condition, before the children of Israel moved out in obedience to God's command, missionaries and Christian workers are finding research information invaluable in laying their plans." And that is the Joshua Project describing itself. The Muslim world obviously was a key target. Following the Glen Erie conference, a huge effort went into developing both the methodologies and the agencies for Muslim evangelization, with special emphasis obviously on contextualizing the Christian gospel so that it could be insinuated seamlessly into an Islamic culture, wherever that culture may be. The debate led to the development of various forms of insider movements in which missionaries would implant small cells of converts into a Muslim society and then cultivate them into spreading. Such movements had long been a feature of evangelization efforts. Again, they weren't new. but they were given much clearer academic and practical definition as the contextualization debate advanced, especially with the introduction in 1991. And bear in mind, this is just 25 years ago. The introduction in 91 by the pseudonymous John Travis of the C1 to C6 contextualization scale. Now, the C1 to C6 scale graded evangelical contact with Muslims into 6 progressively intrusive steps, starting with the conversation, friendly conversation in the street, going through right up to the Messianic mosque and so on. And the secret community of what were called Muslim believers, or, if you like, insider movements. The process of achieving C5 or C6, the higher levels of penetration, involved considerable deception and risk on the part of the missionary. Now, this caused some unease amongst evangelicals themselves, partly on theological grounds, that the Bible was being compromised, and partly on moral grounds, that the deception was wrong. It was immoral. But such reservations certainly didn't blunt the effort. Indeed, as the evangelization of Muslim regions expanded after the late 80s, the training of non-Western operatives became a priority, and the subtlety of the deception increased. The insider movement is now a tactic employed by hundreds of agencies, not just a handful. Agencies large and small. The evangelical wing of the Episcopal Church of America, for example, that alone, and that's a relatively small branch, that alone claims to have formed over 1,000 such movements in the Muslim world. And bear in mind that there are hundreds of agencies doing the same thing. During the 1980s, evangelical strategy gained sharper focus with the rise of dominionism and spiritual warfare. Neither trend was new. Dominionism was really the Great Commission in a modern and more aggressive guise. Spiritual warfare, too, was as old as Christianity itself. What was new was the elaboration of such ideas, thank you very much, it might help, was the elaboration of such ideas as Christian metaphors for the West's, and especially the United States, imperial expansion. Spiritual warfare, to put it bluntly, went with secular warfare, as we'll see. And also, the two ideas had a special resonance for the evangelization of Muslims. The key thinker in this whole business was one of the leading lights in the earlier Lausanne deliberations on cross-cultural evangelization, C. Peter Wagner of Fuller College. Dominionists argue that a precondition for proper evangelization was the taking of secular power over whole communities or nations. It was structural. This involved a comprehensive and systematic campaign of capturing for Christ all influential sectors of an economy and society and government. It meant capturing segments at least influential segments of government, business, family, education, media, entertainment, and religion. And once this comprehensive penetration had happened, the eventual accession of a Christian-dominated covenant government. By definition, covenant basically means a covenant between groups of people who may have different religions, different ideas, but on a Christian, at the basis of a Christian dominant power. By definition, such a strategy was aimed at neutralizing Muslim influence in multi-faith societies, such as Malaysia's, where the Muslim population was politically significant, but where key sectors of life were in the hands of non-Muslims. And obviously economic life is a key here. Spiritual warfare, or prayer warfare in its modern form, evolved very much as an expression of this dominionism. And it was strongly associated with charismatic Pentecostalist group people, followers like C. Peter Wagner, Chuck Pierce, Cindy Jacobs, people like that. It was also tied up with the creation of apostolic networks for eventual global rule, such as the International Coalition of Apostles, which again we can talk about later on. In a crucial sense, the modern spiritual warfare movement evolved in tandem with developments in Western military thinking. Both shared the same electronic technology, the same essential philosophy regarding the non-Western enemy, and the same need for data with which to target your enemy. It was a parallel that was hardly secret. Wagner's World Prayer Center in Colorado, one of the biggest electronic databases, one of the biggest centers of electronic evangelization in the world. One evangelical editor said, was the spiritual version of the Pentagon. And Wagner himself was the church's Norman Schwarzkopf. And for many, an American general, and for that matter, for the US president himself during the 90s, the war against countries such as Iraq and Afghanistan was a war between Christ and Satan. Now, the parallel is an apt one in more ways than one. Proponents of spiritual warfare identify a range of enemies, as I said, including animism, Hinduism, and so on. But there is no question that the evolution of both dominionism and modern spiritual warfare has rested most heavily on the war against Islam. Of all spiritual enemies, Islam is the most intractable, the most challenging, and the most intensely political for the Western evangelical movement. And of all spiritual warriors, perhaps the most qualified to define the task is C. Peter Wagner. For 30 years, professor of church growth at Fuller College. And C. Peter Wagner said, the reality is that Allah is a high-ranking demonic spirit who has come to steal, to kill, and to destroy. Political correctness may attempt to deny this spiritual reality, but it only plays into the hands of the evil principalities and powers over Babylon. The question is, who will rule, the kingdom of darkness or the kingdom of light? Wagner, many Christians will say, is a radical who does not represent their views. But for over 40 years, Wagner has been central to the entire evangelical movement. He was central right at the beginning of the Lausanne movement, for example. And the Lausanne movement is the most respectable global working network that there can possibly be in any faith. For most evangelical Christians, Islam is at least as big a threat as secularism. For many, it is the supreme nest of evil. For Doug Birdsall, the executive chairman of the Lausanne movement, the growth of Islam is, quote, the greatest crisis facing Christians. According to Michael O., the shepherding leader at Lausanne 3 in Cape Town in 2010, Islam is a quote, Islam is a globally coordinated and unbelievably well-funded aggressive movement. And that's a view which is shared by Franklin Graham, who I'm sure you've all heard of Samaritan's Purse, who sees the Third World War as the global fight against Islamic fundamentalism. The evangelist Louis Bush, too, sees Islam reaching out energetically to all parts of the globe. In a similar strategy, Bush says, and he's no relation, we must penetrate the heart of Islam with the liberating truth of the gospel. And for Warren Larson, the director of the Zwemer School of Islamic Studies, Islam is biologically taking over the world. Now, these people are all mainstream evangelicals. They are certainly not on the radical extremist fringe. So, driven by such an ideology and facilitated by the insider movements, the evangelization of the Muslim world takes on an extra urgency. And it takes on a myriad forms, too. Women and children are especially targeted. Women can be approached behind closed doors, and they are considered the key to breaking patriarchal authority. As for children, they are, in the words of Louis Bush, the founder of the 414 window. We know about the 1040 window. The 414 window is age 4 to age 14. Children are, quote, the most receptive and the most effective agents for mission. So when we see an example of child evangelism or concern for child early learning or something like this, I think it's worth bearing in mind this quote: children are the most effective agents for mission. Medical aid is seen as especially useful. 70% of converts to Christianity, some missions estimate, are won through illness and the evangelizing of medical missions in regions where healthcare is poor. Brad Cochran, a Southern Baptist health strategist, puts it in the following way, and I quote him: medical workers can go to places where no one else can go, where no one is going to hear the gospel unless we get there. Good strategies go inside multiple homes multiple times. I can't lead Muslims to Christ in a public setting. Behind closed doors means wherever in a culture you can have intimate conversations. So, this partly explains the number of female medical missionaries in parts of the world like Afghanistan and other parts of the Central Asian part of the world. Furthermore, for many evangelicals, disasters are keenly exploited. K.P. Yohanan, an Indian Gospel for Asia leader, saw the 2004 tsunami as one, quote, one of the greatest opportunities that God has given us to share His love. The Baptist Relief Coordinator, Pat Julian, saw the tsunami as a phenomenal opportunity. And for evangelical leader John Piper, the suffering was God's design. One word from Jesus would have stopped it. He did not speak. This means there is design in this suffering, and all His designs are just and good. And there are less obvious methods of penetrating target communities. And one is the business leadership and success motivation industry, many of whose leading lights, such as Oz Hillman, Ken Blanchard, 1 Minute Manager, I think I remember sitting in UM, in a bus stop at UM, and there was a Malay girl next to me reading Ken Blanchard's 1 Minute Manager. Zig Ziglar and John Calvin Maxwell, 360-degree something. Yeah, leadership. They are all ardent Christian evangelists. To such operatives, the key to subverting Muslim communities is the promotion of self-realization anchored in a vaguely multi-faith but subliminally Protestant philosophy. It's not in your face, it's subtle. And it's not necessarily Christian, it's multi-faith, but subliminally it is Protestant. Presented as an option for Muslim and non-Muslim alike, such strategies are actually essential to the evangelical penetration of the non-Western world. John Calvin Maxwell's leadership group EQUIP, E-Q-U-I-P, for example, has as its goal, and not many people realize this, the, quote, the creation of effective Christian leaders to fulfill the Great Commission in every nation. By 2007, Maxwell could claim he'd produced 1.6 million such leaders. By 2014, this was well over 2 million Christian leaders produced by John Calvin Maxwell, who comes across as being fairly gently multi-faith sometimes, maybe just a little bit Christian, but not too dangerous. So this large-scale recruitment of native Christians through this kind of teaching is central to the evangelical movement's success in penetrating resistant populations. Over the past 40 years, the shift to non-Western missionaries, as I said earlier, has been quite dramatic. In 1973, there were less than 3,500 non-Western missionaries. By 2010, out of the 420-odd thousand full-time missionaries evangelizing the non-Christian world, over 300,000 were non-Western. At the same time, a great effort has been made to conceal Western ownership of the mission network. Even today, while the bulk of the evangelical workforce is now from the so-called two-thirds world, management and control remain in Western hands, and mainly American hands. The Lausanne Congress on World Evangelization illustrates this. Lausanne 3, held in Cape Town, was attended largely by non-Westerners, but some 80% of its funding came from US sources. Now, the outsourcing of evangelical labor in this way is particularly important in the evangelization of Muslims. Latin American missionaries are especially favored, partly because of their physical similarity to Arabs and North Africans. Thousands operate across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, mostly disguised as things like sports coaches. You got them in Malaysia. Medical and dental workers, rural development advisors, and so on. Brazil alone has 12,000 missionaries overseas, and about 2,000 of these are in Muslim countries. But there are also over 6,000 Korean evangelists in Muslim countries, as well as large numbers of Indians, Nigerians, and Chinese. The influx is hardly random. It is strategically organized at the highest level of global mission movement as an attempt to dilute the influence of Islam. And two examples, two strands of this strategy illustrate what I'm saying. In 2005, the Nigerian Evangelical Missions Association announced Operation Samaria, and the sending of 50,000 long-term, cross-cultural, their quotes, Nigerian missionaries over the period 2005 to 2020 through Muslim Africa and the Middle East to Jerusalem. Nigeria was seen as well suited to the task. In the words of Timothy Olonade, in the Nigerian Evangelical Mission Association's executive secretary, quote, "No other African country carries the level of zeal, passion, and aggression for evangelism that the Nigerian church does." And by way of illustration, Olonade saw three imperatives for the task facing the Operation Samaria missionaries. Facing the enemy eye to eye, overrunning the enemy territory, and having a readiness to die. The project was ostensibly Nigerian. It's actually a collaboration between the Nigerian Evangelical Missions Association and a coalition of US mission agencies, amongst them the US Center for World Mission out of Fuller College, New Tribes Mission, Navigators, SIM, Serving in Mission, and Vision Synergy International. It's a collaboration that goes back to the 1960s, with the arrival in Nigeria of groups like Youth with a Mission and Campus Crusade. They've been there for 50 years at least. And also a boom in that country in US-style Pentecostalism, which now accounts for something like 60% of Nigerian Protestants and about 25% of the total population in Nigeria are Pentecostalists. With similar intent, Western and South Korean mission groups have helped to re-energize the Chinese Back to Jerusalem movement. This is the second strand of the strategy that I want to mention. And here, they're re-energizing it with the hope that the Chinese church will send between 100,000 and 200,000 missionaries in the opposite direction, through Muslim Asia to Jerusalem. More than 24 mission agencies are involved in training young Chinese missionaries for the task of evangelizing under a cover of various secular activities, from university student to hairdresser to agricultural engineer and so on. The Chinese are seen to offer particular advantages as evangelical workers They have a racial affinity to Central Asians. They can use the cover of China's rapid secular expansion into the rest of Asia, and for that matter into Africa. And they have a reputed ability to endure considerable suffering. Indeed, this stoicism and the zeal which motivates the project is apparent in the claim by Brother Yun, one of the leading Chinese proponents of Back to Jerusalem, the claim by Brother Yun that, quote, 10,000 Chinese martyrs would be an acceptable price to pay for opening the Muslim world to the gospel. It's significant, too, that the task of motivating Chinese evangelicals for this project has been eagerly taken up by the South Korean mission movement, which itself is strongly Christian Zionist and anti-Muslim, and which itself is a product of US missionizing over the past 50 years or so. Most especially three groups: World Vision, Campus Crusade, and Billy Graham's Youth for Christ. It was Youth for Christ which World Vision emerged from in the 50s. So the Chinese and Nigerian Back to Jerusalem movements are not coincidental. They are key parts of a global evangelical strategy designed by Western agencies and dependent heavily on missionaries from Brazil, Nigeria, India, China, South Korea, and Southeast Asia to infiltrate Muslim regions, strengthen non-Muslim groups, and reinforce the significance of Israel. All told, the global evangelical movement hopes to mobilize up to 200,000 missionaries over the next 10 years or so, to about 2025, for the sole purpose of missionizing the Muslim world. And it is a strategy with decisive secular support. In the past 2 decades alone, the most powerful military machine in the world has devastated 4 Muslim countries and bombed at least 5 others. And in the process, well over 1 million innocent Muslims have been killed. For many, including President Bush and Prime Minister Blair, the justification is partly religious. This is, after all, a just war, a war between light and darkness, as well as for more material things like oil. It's a popular sentiment shared by Christian leaders across the spectrum, from leading Pentecostalists to the Southern Baptist Convention to Anglican bishops in England. But if the sentiment is shared, the language used to express that sentiment comes in many different colors. Take Apostle Cindy Jacobs of the New Apostolic Reformation, of the International Coalition of Apostles, and so on. Apostle Cindy Jacob spoke for many Pentecostalists, and no doubt many others besides, when she said this: in asking why the United States would go into Iraq, one of the main reasons the Lord gave me was that He wanted us to protect Israel from a preemptive attack by Iraq. Another reason the Lord gave me was that He wanted the Middle East to crack open for the gospel. He wanted to humble the spirit of Islam. People like Cindy Jacobs are very popular in Southeast Asia. Sometimes, though, the tone is rather more academic. In his 2002 letter, Richard Land, the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, together with 4 other evangelical leaders, could assure President Bush that he had 8 theologically sound reasons for invading Iraq, including the action's, quote, just and noble intent, its political legitimacy, and its presumed proportionality. These were definitions of a just war. You can go back to Thomas Aquinas, you can go back to various other Christian thinkers defining a just war. In 2002, they were used as justification for bombing the hell out of Iraq. In Britain, however, mainstream clerics are characteristically rather more ambivalent in tone. Bishop Nazir Ali, while heartily endorsing the continued occupation of Afghanistan, is able to say with a somewhat studied detachment, it is not for religious leaders to say when a particular military mission is justified and how to conduct it. And that most liberal of British churchmen, Archbishop Rowan Williams, while opposing the invasion of Iraq, nevertheless manages to find what some would say was the ultimate Christian rationalization for the occupation of Iraq, as well as justification for the Christian West strategy overall. Quote, our forces have been sent to distant parts of the globe, to unfamiliar cultures locked in quarrels and conflicts about which we know very little. They have taken risks, not because people are friends, but in order that they might become friends. Our forces have been at work, not only in the great theaters of Iraq and Afghanistan, but in many other places too, in order to make friends, in order to build harmony and trust between peoples. Now, if a cleric like the very liberal Rowan Williams can so misconstrue the West's military onslaught upon the Muslim world, then some would say the prospects of peace are pretty bleak. I'll end on this simple observation. For years, Western Christians have berated Muslims for their militant theology, for their wild-eyed fundamentalists, and for the failure of moderate Muslims to take full ownership of such aberrations. But where, one has to ask, where are the moderate Christians who are prepared to do the same thing? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ian Buchanan, for a very interesting and elaborate, if I might say, description of the evangelical movement and their attempts into the Muslim world. Now, let me just I'm sure there are a few questions that can be raised about the presentation just now. In general, I would try to give a kind of a framework. In general, what he has been basically explaining from the beginning was basically the history of the evangelical movement and how it has a lot of Western support from the 1970s onwards for obvious reasons. And at the end, he concentrated a bit on the evangelization of the Muslim world and the various approaches there. So if I can take some questions. Yes, please, Dato'. Microphone.
Yeah, thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Mr. Yan Buchanan, first of all, I think I must congratulate you and thank you for writing such a very fantastic and superb book. Very superb. Excellent. I should give you A+ for that. Okay, I've been hearing the lectures given by Mr. Yan. This is a very honest opinion, and I would believe if this sort of lecture should be given not only to the Muslims in Malaysia, but also to the non-Muslim, particularly the Christian Chinese. To the Muslim, I think we have to understand and aware what's going to happen to us as Muslim in this particular part of the region. To the Christian Chinese particularly, they must also understand if they are trapped into these sort of activities, they have nothing to gain, but they will lose also. Okay, my few statements first, and then a few questions that you have to answer. Personally, I'm worried. We are deadly worried when we read the book. I've been carrying this book for 5 years actually. I've been around the country from north to south, from Perlis to Johor, carrying the book, just to inform the whole Muslim in Malaysia so that we should be united, irrespective whether you are the political party or the opposition party, because we are facing the same enemy. According to this book, one statement was very scary, as mentioned by Mr. Yan. The Third World War of today, the Third World War is between the Christian and the Muslim. Though he said fundamentalists, we are the Muslim fundamentalists. That's the first one. And the second one is also very scary, which is in line with Surah Al-Baqarah, ayat 120. Yeah, in line with that. According to this book, the whole world will wage war on Islam. This is what the evangelical people are doing. Yeah, they will influence the whole world. The whole world will wage war on Islam, and Islam will slowly disappear unless Islam converts itself. Yeah, in line with 120 Al-Baqarah. Unless Islam converts itself. That's number one. I'm worried. Number two, I'm also worried, reading at the book, according to you, in Indonesia, though it is almost 90% Muslim country, one of the biggest Muslim country in the world, today in Indonesia, 2 million Muslims are being converted to Christianity every year. So you could imagine, every year 2 million will be converted to evangelist Christianity. And it is said that by the year 2035, Indonesia is not going to be a Muslim country anymore. That's number two. Number three, this is deadly worried. I am trying to relate this problem of evangelical Christianity to our neighbor, Singapore. In your book, you have mentioned a number of times Singapore not only a regional center, but also a world center for this sort of movement, the evangelical. And according to your book, in Singapore, at least 1/3 of the politicians, the ruling party, PAP, they are the believer of this Christian movement. And I checked recently, there are no more 1/3, more than 80% are the believer of evangelical Christianity in Singapore. Majority of students, especially the medical students, are believers of evangelical. And the statement, you have to understand, the problem is nothing wrong, as said by Ian. There's nothing wrong with the Christian if they really follow exactly what the teaching of the religion. In my own experience, 8 years overseas, most of the Christians are good people. I remember when we did not have a place to have our Friday prayers, the university gave us the underground of the chapel. I remember that. For that, we can pray. We have our Friday prayers. I was the president of the Muslim student at Ohio University those days, so I know. But the problem is, according to you, in Singapore, the Christians in Singapore now are becoming increasingly and strongly evangelical. That's the danger. Increasingly and strongly evangelical. Why it is a danger? Because, as said earlier, their aim, their strategy is to destroy the Muslim, covert or overt, military or psychological. So why Singapore? I'm very worried. Singapore is our neighbor, controlled by the ruling party, PAP, and the idea of PAP, and also mentioned in your book, Singapore is the wealthiest Chinese Israel. Chinese Israel. And now the idea is being taken 100% totally by DAP Malaysia. But the worry is our friends in those party, yeah, they are working very closely with DAP, though they are Muslim. They do not know we are helping our enemy to kill the Muslim. Okay, number 2. And number 3, this one I need you to answer. As mentioned by you, yeah, to the Western people, Allah is a demonic spirit. Not only demonic spirit, the high-ranking demonic spirit called Allah. And not only, I read one of your statement, in the US, none of the US leaders, i.e. the President of United States, are believers of the false God, such as Allah. False God, Tuhan tipu. So Allah they say demonic spirit, Allah they say false God. How come in Malaysia, they are fighting like crazy, they want to use the word Allah in our country? Why? Even in the Western world, they say Allah is demonic spirit. Yeah, the high-ranking demonic spirit, false God. But in Malaysia, even among our fellow friends, Muslim friends in the opposition party, are supporting this idea that Allah must be used by everybody. And we pray the same God. But those are Muslims who mention it. Now, I'm not worried if it is mentioned by the non-Muslim. Okay? So, okay. My first question, Singapore. In what way Singapore, well, I don't want to be too sensitive here. In what way that the Malaysians government and the Muslim in Malaysia have to be very careful when we have our diplomatic relation with Singapore. Knowing the background of Singapore, because Singapore is the strongest believer, even more stronger than US and South Korea in terms of believing in this religion we call evangelical Christian. Yes, that's number 1, Singapore. And number 2, Allah. Why only in Malaysia now? They are crazy at fighting the word Allah to be used. And number 3, this is a very sensitive question. Number 2, why in Malaysia the non-Muslim and even some of our Muslim friends maintain that the word Allah must be used here? In which I did mention that in your book you said Allah is being said as a demonic spirit and false god. Why here? Why now? This Christian insists that we must use the word Allah. Such a contradiction. Okay, last message. Sorry, I am also a professor in politics. Okay, okay. The last question. This is a bit sensitive. Okay, in Indonesia, you did mention the person who's responsible to bring this idea of liberal plural is our old friend Gus Dur. You did mention in your book, Gus Dur, liberal plural, and Gus Dur, twice he visited Israel, and he is committee members and board in so many Israel committees, something like that. Okay, that's in Indonesia. In Malaysia, you did mention one particular name, and this, my friends, you have to understand this. This particular name is also responsible in two things. In your notes, you mentioned, if I read it correctly. Number one, this particular person is responsible. He is being taken into the US policy machine. You remember that? I can memorize your words. I hope you can memorize it too. US policy machine, meaning that US role, according to you, is to Americanize Islam, yeah, for the sake of power, politics, economy, and the rest, and oil. To change our mind. That's a word there. I have the book there. To Americanize Islam. Okay. Because I've been reading your book for 5 years, you know. Yes, I know better than you. Sorry. Okay. Number one, to bring this particular person, a Muslim, a leader in Malaysia, into US policy machine, meaning that he is helping the US government in terms of policy relating to anything to do with Islam. I believe so. That includes to liberalize our mind, to Americanize our mind, number one. Number two, it is also mentioned the lobbyist group. That one, he's shaking his head. He agreed with me. Yeah. The lobbyist group in US, as we know, the lobbyist group in US are almost 100% Zionist. You like it or not? The lobbyist group are 100% supporter of this particular person. Okay, I mentioned the name, Anwar Ibrahim. So the name is mentioned in the book. What page in your note? Can you elaborate on these two things? Don't worry, in front. I'm not afraid to say it because I know I got so many evidence to support your statement. Concrete evidence, documented evidence. So don't worry about that. You will never be sued. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Tan Sri. Would you like to respond to that or take a few questions?
Can I quickly take
one
by one? Can I just deal with this first? Just a number of points. I'm not going to get too deeply involved in the very last personality. But what I can do is make some general comments about the questions overall. I think when we look at any country in Southeast Asia, whether it's Indonesia, Malaysia, or Singapore, we've got to look at the overall context here. So these three countries do have integrations into relationships, which is defined more broadly, more widely. They also have certain characteristics which link them closely. And one of those characteristics is the Chinese diaspora. All three countries have got Chinese populations. Now this raises the whole question of Chinese people as fifth columns and so on. I must be very, very clear that in my own thinking, the problem is really a particular outside construction of Chineseness. And that is a construction which is essentially geared towards Christian Chinese and not Chinese. That raises the question of just what proportion are we talking about? And we're talking about a very small group, a very small proportion of Chinese are evangelical Christians. Whether you look in this part of the world, in Malaysia, or in Indonesia, or for that matter in Singapore, a minority. It's this minority that we're concerned about, and they're not only Chinese. They are all sorts of other things too. In Indonesia, a lot of Christians are non-Chinese. In Malaysia, a lot of Christians are Indian. So there are differences of various kinds. But one of the key problems in this sort of neck of the woods, where there is an incredible ethnic diversity, one of the key problems is the entry of outside groups who are intent on splicing religious and ethnic considerations. Now, these combinations may not be indigenous, they may not be native, there may have been no problem at all in previous decades. Now you're getting people coming in, and I can mention, there's one in particular, a Copt. Well, actually is an American Coptic Christian with Egyptian backgrounds. He comes in and he preaches to the Bumiputra Christians and stirs up resentment against Muslims and says that it is biblically ordained that the Bumiputras the Bumiputra Christians in this part of the world are acting as gatekeepers for the Chinese and the Indians to come in and to liberate. Now that is awful thing, an awful thing to say. It is a dangerous thing to say. It's not a local person that's saying it, it's an outsider who's saying it. He's coming in and he's stirring up this kind of ethnic, religious dissension and opposition between people. So I think we have to be very clear. Who are we talking about? We're talking basically about people from outside who are looking at a particular cultural and ethnic situation and seeing how can we best exploit this situation. So part of the donning of the armor of God, if you like, part of the self-defense, the strengthening, is to understand what is going on amongst in these people's minds. What are their strategies? What are they trying to do? And that way, people in Southeast Asia as a whole, not just Malaysia, can certainly be a bit stronger once they have learned, have studied, have understood what the strategies from outside are. As far as the particular position of Singapore is concerned, well, I've mentioned that in the book. As I say, a minority of Singaporean Christians are in fact evangelical. A fairly sizable minority, yes. And there is an identification between Singapore and Israel. We know that from documented history that the Israelis have helped the Singaporeans in the past. We also know in modern times that a number of Christian Zionist groups have sought to locate themselves in Singapore and identify Singapore as having a significance which is, if you like, Christian Zionist in character. Again, outside groups coming in and trying to define the situation for local people. So I think we have to be very careful. I won't comment in any detail at all on what was said about a particular personality who shall remain nameless. Can I just say that I don't want to say too much on Malaysia at the moment, because a book is coming out anyway in the next couple of weeks. It'll be on the internet. It'll be an e-book, so it'll be completely open to anybody to read without having to pay any money at all. It'll be available hopefully in a couple of weeks or so, and that deals with some very complex situations. There are 225 footnotes, so it's fairly well documented, I hope. And I would beg people to read that book, to digest it, and then inshallah later on we can discuss situation more seriously. For the time being though, I have focused my talk today on the global context, and that is what I certainly would be happy to address. Thank you.
Yes, I think I should explain also that the question came from Tan Sri Dr. Ibrahim Shah, who is actually a member of the Dewan Negara. So that's why he's bringing all these political sides to it. Yes, I think there's a lot of discussion that has to still to be done, because there are a lot of things that we conflate when we talk about racial identities in Malaysia. We conflate racial and religion together to make that a certain religion is only followed by a certain race. This is the problem that we have. Problems of identity is quite a common problem in post-colonial states, I would believe. Anyway, there is another discussion probably suitable for sociologists. Anyway, I'll have another question from Professor Mudassir. Yes.
Thank you very much. Maybe I should begin by saying that I'm going to be very brief, inshallah. Now, like many people here, I'm sure, I have been reading and thinking about things, such as you've been talking about this afternoon, this morning. Evangelicism, etc., and Christian Zionism and the rest for a long, long time. But I must say that I haven't at all either read or heard any discussion as systematic and detailed and thought-provoking as you, Mr. Buchanan, have given us this morning. And for that reason, I wanted first of all to express my thanks and appreciation. And maybe I should add that I haven't read your book, but I heard about it, and I've already subscribed to the book, and I'm waiting for a copy to come, inshallah, shortly. The short question I wanted to ask fits into your global perspectives. But it is not concerned at the moment with the substance of what you've been saying, rather about the reactions or the response or responses to this whole movement and the strategies that have been evolved in its context. I wanted to ask about the reactions. Have you come across? Do you know much about? Can you tell us about whether there have been any really serious efforts, organized efforts on the part of either Hindus or Buddhists, and especially among Muslims, to respond effectively and intelligently to the very serious and profound and real challenges that you have so very well explained. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments, and your question amuses me for reasons I'll explain. When anyone writes a book, they hope for a response. And in doing this, I felt driven by the significance of the situation, particularly for Muslims. Having written the book, I was staggered to see that the main response came from a rather different area. The book was circulated in India, and the people who were most exercised by it were not Muslims. They were Hindu nationalists and Hindu fundamentalists, you could say, in many cases. And while many of the ideas that they promote I personally disagree with intensely, and I think Narendra Modi is an example of some of the things that I would disagree with, I was vaguely amused that there was very little response from Muslims. There was a very gracious contribution from Prof. Zulkifli. I think in Uttasan, you did say something quite valuable in that. There were one or two comments, but I got the impression that it didn't really provoke a great deal of serious discussion. Now, that may be me living in an English-speaking circuit and not being aware that there were things going on outside there which I cannot plumb, I cannot understand. So, forgive me, I may be wrong. But definitely, I was quite taken by the emphasis that the Indians gave it. They were immensely, I mean, you could look at the internet, and most of the references to the book are from India. So, yes, that. The book was reviewed in Britain, in Malaysia, by an evangelical leader, a man called Dr. Alex Tang, who heads the Spiritual Formation Institute in Johor. And his review said that, well, I wouldn't really call many of these groups evangelical. And he quoted the Haggai Institute for Leadership in Singapore. He said, groups like this are not evangelical. Well, Haggai himself actually states in his brochures, the only thing that we are concerned with at Haggai is evangelism. So I politely wrote back to this gentleman and I told him, you obviously don't even know your own people. Because Haggai is one of the main leadership people in Southeast Asia. And if one of the main thinkers in the evangelical movement in Malaysia doesn't even know that he's an evangelical, then it's a bit shallow. So that's an answer to your question. That's the sort of reaction I've had. I am heartened by people coming and listening to this. I am very heartened by the participation of Professor Zulkifli, because he is in many ways a man after my own heart. He's concerned and he wants to do something about it. But I would say, please, that in about 2 weeks' time, the International Movement for a Just World, under Chandra Muzaffar, I'm sure many of you know this, they will be publishing a book which is much more detailed, and as I say, which has 225 footnotes. On this, can I ask my wife to give me a rolled up, a little rolled up thing in the, I'd just like to, I would just like to make a point, which I think most of you are aware of already, but which can be made probably quite effectively by showing you a list of evangelical agencies which have an active interest in Malaysia. Evangelical agencies which have an active interest in Malaysia. And there are about 600 here, and they are American, Nigerian, Israeli, Chinese, Filipino, Zambian, Kenyan, Brazilian, and so on and so on and so on. They are all, and when I say they have an active interest in Malaysia, I mean that they have sent missionaries here, they have missionaries here, they have representatives here and so on. It's not just that they're connected by internet. These people have, in one way or another, an actual physical presence in Malaysia. So all I'm saying is that the problem is immense, the problem of outside groups coming here. And in a way, it's a good thing, because Malaysia has a reputation of being a very welcoming country. And this is actually stated in a number of websites, that we come to Malaysia, A, because it's diverse, ethnically, linguistically, religiously, and so on. There's a terrific diversity. It is literally, quote, a laboratory for what we can do elsewhere in Asia. That's why we come here. We like it. Now that brings with it two things. It brings with it opportunities for these people, but it also brings with it responsibilities. And those responsibilities are ones which sometimes are overstepped and ignored. And I think this is the gist, this is the nub of the problem in this part of the world. There is an enormous presence from outside, and it's a presence which sometimes comes with a lack of responsibility.
I will just thank you very much, Ian, for that very lucid presentation. I've just got one question following up from what was asked. Being part of the leadership chair, in a university, what could you suggest that we do now that you say the response is very lukewarm, and in fact there's no response at all from the Muslim world? What can we do to move forward to ensure that, you know, whatever you have described could, if not be stopped, but at least we can mitigate it? And I'm also very, very anxious to participate in one roundtable that's coming this weekend that talks about Malaysia without Islam. Already we are entertaining that idea of Malaysia without Islam. I know there's a book, The World Without Islam. To me, if you don't understand this, then Malaysia without Islam could be a real thing. Could you please comment?
I can start by saying that there is an institution in London called the School of Oriental and African Studies. And one of the, well, so it's self-identifying. It studies Oriental and African countries, cultures, religions, and so on. I think there is plenty of scope for this kind of institution here. There is another institution which I would mention in tandem with that, and that's Fuller Seminary in the United States. Fuller Seminary is a nerve center of evangelical learning, and the key to the whole institution is that it puts evangelicalism on an academic, on a social science footing. It makes it respectable academically. It uses footnotes. It uses researchers. It goes into the field. It writes books. It writes peer-reviewed articles and so on about serious connections between religion and secular world. And this, I think, probably should be the underlying definition of any institution that you may wish to think about here. That is one that looks very carefully at the secular and religious connections in those influences from outside which affect this part of the world. Look out, look at things like the evangelical movement in the United States and other parts of the world. Look at the connections with China, with geopolitics in the Middle East, with the Pentecostalization of Latin America, with the way in which all these things gel together, all these things come together in the minds of the thinkers in Fuller College. Do they come together in the same way in the minds of thinkers in Malaysia? If they don't, and I'm sure amongst some people they do, there is that realization that these things can be global, they can be systematically devised, they can be systematically targeted, and they can be constructed in such a way, packaged in such a way that they're very difficult to understand, such as contextualization of the Bible. These things are all extremely subtle and well thought out, and they can be countered with knowledge. They can be countered with hard work, hard research, study, and understanding. And possibly, and I don't have a vested interest here, I do say, if this is the case, there has to be a greater facility in the English language, because a lot of this stuff is in English. And these people know how to use the language. In fact, they don't only know how to use English, they know how to use 6,000 other languages.
Yes. Can you please, before you ask the question, can you please introduce yourself and where you are from? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk. I am Usama Kanakir from Syria. I'm a lecturer at this faculty. In an talk show, TV talk by John Brickens, who is previously an economic hitman, American, as the writer. A TV talk by John Brickens, an American. He is the writer of the book, as I remember the titles, Confession of an Economic Hitman. He was one of the best sellers in America. So he made some examples how the American intervention in the world. He gave example how they intervene, for example, in the Middle East, in Iran, in Saudi. Then he gave another example in Latin America, the president of Panama, of Cuba. Then he gave another example about Southeast Asia, the previous president of Indonesia. So he mentioned some names and the way they intervene. Then he make a comparison between the Soviet Union and America nowadays. He said, this is the interesting point. He said that the Soviets at that time, they really are concerned about the thoughts. So their thoughts, they want to spread their beliefs. But Americans, the politics nowadays in America, they are concerned in getting only money and economic purposes. So the question is, do all the people involved, the money involved you mentioned, and all this, all the numbers, the big numbers, do really are aimed for economic purposes, to be specific for money and greed? Thank you very much.
The biggest difference between the USSR or Russia on the one hand and the US on the other is that one is, at least was until recently, statist, and the other is corporate private enterprise. If you look at most of the evangelical agencies, you will see that there is a very, very significant corporate contribution to the operation of that agency. World Vision, for example, has got over 200 corporate partners. Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, Monsanto, all these people who use World Vision as a corporate shop window. Now, this raises a point which we could discuss some other time. You take any agency of the size of World Vision, they fulfill basically 2 or 3 different functions, as I mentioned. One is political, one is religious, the other is corporate. They are concerned very much with promoting a way of life. They're not simply concerned with promoting profit making. They're not simply concerned with political influence in a part of the world. They're not simply concerned with religion. They're concerned with promoting a vision. And that vision is predominantly Protestant. It is predominantly American. It is the two together. American, Protestant, well, the Protestant ethic. And so when you say the Russians are promoting an idea and the Americans are really concerned with money, well, you're quoting this man. I would disagree with that. The Americans are also promoting a particular vision of what is ideal, what is desirable, what they want. And that involves an enormous amount of thinking around how do you get what you want? Because you're dealing with the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is very diverse. It speaks many different languages. It is from many different cultures, and many don't want us to be the people who make the profit. They want to make the profit. So it involves careful thinking. And I would say that Fuller College, World Vision, and a lot of these other evangelical groups are fulfilling a mission which is partly ideological in the sense of conveying an economic philosophy as well as a religious one. So it is complicated, but it still requires an enormous amount of thought. Not just profit, not just filthy lucre, filthy money. Do I answer your question? I don't know the book. I've heard of it, yeah, but I haven't read it. Okay.
My name is Rahman from ISMA. I think this is a very strong collaboration between the Jew, Zionist, and the evangelical movement. How far is it true? Because all in all, the world is governed by the Jew, really, through proxies.
This raises the question of the definition of Christian Zionism and the way in which this is rationalized in terms of, well, a host of different considerations. One being the way in which the Chinese are regarded, because the Chinese are seen by Israel as being belonging to the one country that has been very soft on Israel and been very moderate, if you like, in its position vis-à-vis the Israeli political position. So it's a complex question. The evangelicals consist of people who would like to see the Jews converted to Christianity and many who hate Jews. The Jews themselves, or at least the Zionists, have very often no love at all for the right-wing evangelical Christians, but they're useful. So to some extent it's a matter of mutual usefulness without any love. There is a Likud wing which is quite close to the evangelical movement in the United States, yes. But there are also quite a number of Jewish groups who resent enormously the way in which evangelical Christians are trying to poach, trying to take over Judaism. So I think we have to distinguish between political Zionism and Judaism. They're two very different things. What we probably see in this part of the world more is Christian Zionism or Zionism. Judaism, there's probably not an awful lot of it. Yes, there is this relationship. Yes, it is a relationship of mutual usefulness, if you like. It's fraught by an enormous amount of other considerations. The strength of AIPAC in the United States, the role of Jews in, or Zionists, I must stress this again, the role of Zionists in controlling economic power. I would say that a lot of economic power is also in the hands of radical Christians or evangelical Christians. It's not just Zionists and Jews who control the world. But certainly it's a complicated matter. Certainly there is a connection, yes. And it is a connection which is troublesome because it leads to an enormous amount of difficulty in resolving the situation in the Middle East, for example. It also has spin-offs into other parts of the world. For example, the Zionists are encouraging the development of Zionist communities in various strategic parts of India, and they're having conversion ceremonies in Nepal, in Manipur, and places like that, on the basis of the idea of the Menashe, I forget the term now, but the lost tribes of Israel. So there is a tendency to use religion again in political terms. Yeah, it's a dangerous matter. Again, these are things which need to be thought about very carefully, and again could form part of the syllabus of the new institute that's going to come.
One more please. One more question from me. I would like to ask, how do you think about the effectiveness of Muslim Da'i efforts in Malaysia, like Da'wah organizations, and even at global level we have Ahmad Didat and Zakir Naik. Are these efforts strong enough to stop, to curb or to fight against this Christian movement?
I answer that with two particular situations, two particular cases. Firstly, Ahmad Didat is able to quote the Bible, chapter and verse, from beginning to end. He's done his homework. He's spent a lot of his life researching and getting to understand how the other side works. So here's an example of this enormous need for and capacity of Muslims to get under the skin, to do hard research, to understand where the threat is coming from. Secondly, my wife came home one day in Leicester from walking down the nearby street. She had bumped into a local Muslim person. I forget exactly what the situation was. What had happened? No, how did you meet? You're just looking at it. Yeah. And my wife said I came from Malaysia. And she then said, well, Malaysia is a very tolerant, diverse and tolerant country. And religions, the caliphate cannot work in Malaysia. And he said, well, that's not a Muslim country. Malaysia is not a Muslim country. Muslims are not true Muslims. Yeah. So the point I want to make by that is that on the one hand there is a need for a very broad vision which will feed into really coming to grips with a complicated situation and understanding it. On the other hand, there is still a fairly narrow fundamentalist view of things, and in particular the relationship between secular and religious, because the two go together, the two combine, and they have to combine in everyday life as well as in philosophizing and so on. Beyond that, I wouldn't like to comment, because I am not privy to a lot of what goes on in Malaysia in particular, being somebody who does not speak good Malay. I speak Malay, but it's Pasar Malay. It's not good Malay. and so I can only go back to my question to a number of my friends. Can you tell me, can you give me a list of Muslim organizations in Malaysia which are replicating what a lot of the evangelical groups are doing? In other words, setting up old people's homes, looking after drug addicts, looking after homeless children and so on, and migrant workers, this, etc., etc., etc. Can you give me a list of the agencies, the Muslim agencies, which take that kind of secular interest in the world they live in? I've asked this question a number of times. I still haven't got a list. So, I don't know. Maybe there are. Pardon? Yeah. This is one of the most worrying things, that the whole point of my talk was that evangelicals operate in terms of the reciprocity, the reciprocal working of secular religious penetration. They work on the basis of those two going together. They have to go together. So you've got groups of churches called the externally focused groups of churches. Now they function in Malaysia very strongly. They're all over the place. And what are they doing? They're setting up things like, let's take an example, the externally focused church network in Malaysia plans to set up a thing called Project Harapan. I think I can say this because it's simply stating what's already on the internet anyway. They plan to set up a thing called Project Harapan, which is a group of 576 early learning centers spread throughout Malaysia. The rationale for this is that poor people are not being given early learning facilities. So we will do it. So they set up these centers, and one of the early ones was set up in the flat of a Malay family in Malacca. A Malay family. And this Malay family was carted around Malaysia on for conferences and dinners and in Penang and so on, and exhibited as an example of Christian multi-faith generosity. They were being used as a public relations gimmick. Now, these people are the people who are planning to set up 576 early learning centers dotted around Malaysia. In a way, good luck to them, as long as they don't touch Muslims. Why not? There's a lot of poor Indians, poor Chinese, poor Bumiputra Christians and so on, and they need help maybe. But there is that element of deception, and that is what worries me about the ceding responsibility, ceding the right for these outside groups to come in and set up all these things in the secular world in Malaysia. Malaysians should be doing it themselves, instead of letting groups like the Externally Focused Church come in and set up early learning centers in Malay flats, Malay houses in Malacca, and then using the Malay families as publicity fodder. This happens. And maybe this is a reason why there should be a more careful thinking. But that it's not for me to say that. It's for me to simply say, look, this is what is happening. I cannot say you have to do this, that, or the other. It's not my right to do that. But I can point to what's happening. And I hope that in pointing at, and as I say, please read the book when it comes out, in about a fortnight, I would think. There will hopefully be a lot to think about and digest, I don't know. You may already know it all before, but that's the long answer to a short question. Okay.
Thank you again, Mr. Ian. I think at the bottom line of the conclusion, I think we can basically say that there is a gap that is being taken over by the evangelical Christians in supporting Muslims who are poor, and that gap ideally should be filled by Muslim organizations. And I hope that should be, I think, the word that we take forward from today, apart from the elaborate and very, very detailed discussion that has followed it. I'd like to thank Mr. Ian for such a very good talk. And I think this session, we'd like to end by giving a clap, and then we'll forward it to the chairperson. Thank you.
As a token of appreciation to both of the moderator and guest speaker, we would like to call upon Yang Berbahagia, Professor Zulkifli bin Abdul Ghani, Deputy Vice Chancellor, Academic and Internationalization, to give some, we call it as Chandramata, to both of them. First, I would like to call upon Dr. Nasrin. And for sure, our honorable guest speaker, Mr. Ian Buchanan. Thank you, Prof. Zulkifli Abdul Ghani. And as a saying goes, to every beginning there is an ending. And now, once again, thank you everyone for gracing our public lecture today with your presence, and we really appreciate it. And I have a special pantun for you, Mr. Ian Buchanan. And I created this just now in Malay language. I know you can understand Malay language. Good, eh? Alright. Puteri Raja berhias cantik di laman istana melayan tetamu. Mr. Ian Buchanan, janganlah serik. Oh, okay. Can you translate this or yeah? I have a special pantun for Mr. Ian. Alright. Dengar. Okay, eh? Puteri Raja berhias cantik di laman istana melayan tetamu. Mr. Ian Buchanan, janganlah serik. Datanglah lagi ke USIM, kongsikan ilmu. And thank you. And with that, let us conclude this ceremony by reciting Suratul As and Tasbih Kafarah. And everyone is invited for lunch. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi taala wabarakatuh.
Thank you. We'll see you on the Malaysia with us.
Yes, we'll be coming to the UAE.
Inshallah. Sure. Many thanks, eh? Very good. Inshallah. Go for lunch?
Yes, sure.
Yeah?
You happen to have a card? Sorry.